Hey everybody, it's Dr. Jensen with CCJ 3701, Research Methods in Criminology. So this lets you kind of see how the methods section is going to come together. Now notice there is a second video that has to do with how to build a methods section and how to write hypotheses. We'll spend a little bit of time on that together here as well, but make sure you watch these two videos together because they're going to help you draft your section and get you started. So I thought for fun I would show you a methods section example that comes from something you already did in class. Remember that lab where you learned how to build a scale and you went into the general social survey data set and you found all these variables about abortion and you had to build an abortion scale that represented people's opinions or attitudes in varying circumstances of abortion and kind of take all those together and sum them into some kind of score that would help us understand overall how they feel about abortion. Do you remember doing that? Well, this is the methods section that would go with building a variable like that. So that way you can kind of see how this starts to emerge when you write your paper. So I'm very methodical in how I teach this class. Whenever I do labs, I always require that you write down how you recode things, how you build scales, how your scale works, because that is information that has to be presented later in your research report or your paper. So my intention was to create habits for you to get used to writing down changes you made to variables and how that worked, because you have to write about it later anyway. So when you get ready to work on your variables and make changes to them, again, realizing if you have nominal variables that are in categories, almost always those have to be recoded so you can make specific kinds of comparisons and tests for differences. Okay? If you have a big concept like delinquency or mental health or social class or those kind of things, those almost always require some kind of scale. So you can bring multiple pieces together to illustrate what social class is or what delinquency is. You can't just let robbery represent delinquency. Delinquency has a lot of stuff in it. You can't just let education represent social class. Social class has a lot of stuff in it. So as you start to come into decisions on changes you make about your variables, you're going to start kind of jotting down the value labels and making your coding scheme and actually applying those changes and recoding variables, building scales and summations. You're probably going to be jotting those things down in a notebook or in a document. You have to take those jottings and transform them into a methods section so your reader knows what you did. Remember, your reader does not have your data. They don't have SPSS, so you have to introduce your variables to them. You have to tell them how they've been changed so that if they were to go and get your data and get SPSS and run these analyses themselves, they would know how you did it. It's a matter of transparency. In science, we always keep our transparency intact because we want people to replicate us. We want there to be truth and honesty in what we do so that people know exactly how we did it and they can see the logic and the soundness in the approach to the study. Okay, so let's go through this example and you'll see what I mean. So here's the research question. Now you don't have to do this in your draft because I already know your research question, but I put it here so you know what it was. So this is just for reference purposes. Is education related to attitude toward abortion? You actually tested that using the ANOVA statistic. Remember you had that variable called degree? And you were looking at people at different education levels and seeing if their score on the abortion scale changed. You ran that test. You know the answer to that question. But before you present the results and run the analyses, you have to do this section first, the methods, to say, this is how I got my data, these are all the variables I'm using, these are changes I made to my variables, and then this is what I found out. Okay, so people are prepared to see what you found out. They have to know what you had to work with. So that was the research question. You will have a set of hypotheses that go inside your methods section. So we talk about a null and an alternative hypothesis with most statistics. I haven't spent a lot of time on that with the earlier statistics like the chi-square test or the ANOVA or the t-test because we don't use them very often in formal research papers. But when it comes to regression types of statistics like linear regression or logistic regression, we actually do hypothesize about things quite a bit. So we have what we call the null hypothesis, which basically assumes that there is no relationship. There is nothing that these topics have to do with each other. They're not related. We call it the null. Null meaning negative or never. The alternative hypothesis is always that there is a relationship between these two things, okay? So that's the null and the alternative. Of course, we think there is a relationship, so we usually like to try to reject the null and accept the alternative and say, yeah, look, see, I showed you. These two things actually predict each other. I'm right. But we always assume that they really aren't related. We call it the null. So you'll present those hypotheses, and the next video will go into more detail as to how that works. You'll also make some more hypotheses that have to do with predictions you want to make about how your control variables are going to do. So maybe you're going to use a control variable called race, or maybe you're going to use one called age, or income, or education, or gender. So you might want to make predictions as to how you think the groups or the scores or values inside those variables will work. So maybe you say, I think people with higher income will have this result. I think males will have this result compared to females. I think people of this racial group will be different. You can talk about things like increases or decreases and stuff. You can talk about things being more likely or less likely for one group or another. And we'll talk about that in another video as well. But you would present those hypotheses. Here comes the data and methods. So you always start with the data. I will test these hypotheses using data collected from, and here's where the name of the survey comes, the 2004 Sociology Chicago Survey of 5,856 randomly sampled, non-institutionalized adults in the United States. So you have a sentence that says, here's the name of my data, here's the year it came from, and this is the number of people I had in there. And it's, you know, by the way, it's people over 18. I didn't put that in there, but you could say stuff like that. Or this is just a data set of juveniles. You want to describe kind of who that group is that got surveyed or interviewed and ultimately in the data set. Then you talk a little bit about the sample. The random selection technique utilized with the population ensured an equal chance for every person to be selected in the sample. This is what we call a simple random sample. The SCS, you can refer to like an abbreviated version of your study if it's too wordy to say. So you kind of said SCS. You could just say AdHealth. After you present the formal title, the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent to Adult Health, you could literally just say, in parentheses, AdHealth, and then just refer to it as AdHealth thereafter. The SCS is a sociological survey that collects information on demographic attributes and opinions of people residing in the United States, which is conducted face-to-face interviews by the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago. And then you keep going. Interviews take about 90 minutes to administer, and results are de-identified to ensure the confidentiality of respondents before releasing the data publicly to the research community. So you have some statements that say, how did I get the data? Was it a survey? Was it an interview? Was it a computer interview? Was it a web survey? How long did they last? How did they work? Were they mailed? Were they done on a computer? Who collected it? Was it a research center or a research team? Maybe it was a university. Maybe it was a government entity. You want to put those kind of details in there. Okay? And then once you're done describing the data, you just launch right into your variables. And this is an easy way to do it. Among many topics presented in the SCS, respondents were asked to indicate their level of education in a range from 0 years or no formal schooling to 12 years high school education to up to 20 years, meaning you've had 8 years of college and perhaps a graduate degree like PhD, MD, so forth. So you tell them, I'm using this variable, it's called education. This is what's in the education variable. And then you tell them anything else. Responses of don't know or blank responses were coded as missing data and excluded from the study. That's a pretty common statement to have in a methods section, so there's only so many ways to write that. So you may need to kind of mimic what that says a little bit. So that just introduced the independent variable right there. 2 sentences. I'm using education, this is what's in there, and this is what was provided. Okay? Then you move into the next variable, the dependent. Respondents were also asked several questions indicating their attitude toward abortion in varying contexts. These items are the primary variables of interest in the study. These are the main ones I'm using. Then, here we talk about the variables for the abortion scale. There are 7 items or survey questions designed to measure a person's attitude toward abortion. And then you actually list all the items. Okay? The first item measured a person's response to approving abortion when there is a strong chance of serious defect in the baby. The second item measured a person's response to abortion when a woman's married and doesn't want any more children. The third item measured a person's response when the woman's health is in danger. The fourth item was when the family's low income and can't afford the child. The fifth one, when the woman was raped, and so on and so forth. So you actually list all the pieces of your scale, describing them like you would see in the variable label, all the way until you're done. Okay? And then again, those items are coded the same. So you can say right here at the end, all these attitude toward abortion questions contained responses of yes or no. So you actually list ones were yes and twos were no's. Responses of don't, know, or blank were coded as missing and excluded. And then if you made any recoding changes, which you did, you have to tell the reader what you did. The abortion questions of yes or no were recoded into scores of either 1 or 0, so that scores of yes could be summed into a score by awarding them 1 point apiece. Summing these scores allowed me to create an attitude toward abortion scale, with scores of 7 indicating that respondents approved abortion for all of the 7 reasons given in the questions, and scores of 0 indicating that respondents didn't approve any of the reasons. This scale was used as the dependent variable in the study. The respondent's level of education was the independent variable. So now you've just described your variables. Now you're ready to report the results. So you've just told the reader, here's my data, here's how I got it, here are my variables, this is how they were presented to me originally, these are the changes I made, and you describe how you recoded them, you describe how you shoved them together or pulled them apart, any conditions you put inside them, and you literally write in the methods section how you would talk about them to another person across the table. I recoded 0 or 1 into yes, no. And so that's why I would have you do that in lab, so you got used to writing those kinds of things. So hopefully that feels a little bit more natural to you because you've had some practice. Okay? But that's essentially what your method section is going to look like. Now you're going to have 3 more variables because you're going to choose 3 control variables that you will also have to describe and explain what they are originally and then any changes you make to them in some subsequent paragraphs after you're done talking about the independent and the dependent variable. So usually we talk about the independent variable first. It's not bad to do the dependent first. It kind of depends on what you're ready to talk about. Then you talk about your control variables. When you're done with all your variables, usually at the end, you actually write out some hypotheses or predictions, because that's when the reader's familiar with your variables. They know what's in there and how they work. Now they're ready to see what you predict about them. This is how I think it's going to go when I actually run the analyses. And now they're ready to see what you found out. So that's essentially a method section. So let me show you one more thing, kind of for funners. Okay. Over here, I actually have a study that was done with AdHealth. So I just want you to see how real this is. Okay. So this is an article, a journal article from the Crime and Delinquency Journal, which is one of the top journals in criminology, that was done using AdHealth, the very data you have in class. So researchers use it all the time. So this article was published in 2009, Parent-Child Conflicts, School Troubles, and Differences in Delinquency Across Immigrant Generations. That's actually pretty cool. It was done by Home Bowie at University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Okay, but this is actually kind of a cool article because it does the same stuff you do. Look at this. Okay, so they talk about their literature review. This is my topic. This is what we know about it. Here's the background, and this is what the research has found to date. And this is why my study is necessary. Then, later on, we're ready to see theory and eventually methods. Look at this. It says sample and data. So journal articles are written the very same way you're doing your research paper. This study uses data collected by the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health. Okay? And then it says it uses a sampling design that was a stratified sample based on regions and clustering based on schools to select a probability-based representative sample of students from grades 7 through grades 12 in the United States. Okay, so they're describing the data. They're describing who's in the population and how the sample worked. Okay, they go into a little more detail than you really need to, but because they're focused on immigration and race, they had a few sentences that talked about how they were able to get enough people in each racial group represented. So people who were Puerto Rican, Cuban, or Chinese were oversampled, and so on and so forth, so that way they had enough people to utilize in the study. So they got extra amounts of those people. Okay, and then they talk about the 3 waves, the data files, like wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, wave 4. These were in-home interviews of children and parents, and then they did follow-up interviews of those kids in wave 2. Eventually, they had this many cases, and this is how many they're going to be studying in the data file for the analysis.